Hello, everybody. It is a beautiful October day here in Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm based. And this is our third IDEA 2030 webinar, whatever we choose to call it these days. IDEA stands for Imagining a Digital Economy for All. And this is a research project that we had launched earlier this year with the objective of trying to understand how technology, digital technology, is changing our lives. We understand that digital technology is both a force for multiplication, it's also a force for division. And what we have been trying to understand over the course of this research is where does it act as a multiplier and where does it act as a divider, and how can one move the needle in the direction of multiplier as in a force for inclusion, a force for democratization, a force for access, a force for providing resources for those who want to build something, for those who want to have their voices heard, for those who want to close a gap in reaching out to the rest of the world that had existed before. Now, as soon as we launched this project, we were also hit with another major force, which is COVID-19. And of course, within a few weeks, the entire world had shut down in some way, shape, or form. And in the absence of those on the front lines, those who are working in healthcare or in preparing food, delivering food, or checking out food at the cash registers in grocery stores, most of us who had access to a device were opening a device and trying to get in touch with our coworkers, our loved ones, even our doctors, teachers, and whoever else we would ordinarily just go out and meet, or get on a plane to meet, or get on a bus to meet. So we didn't ask for a pandemic. Nobody asked for a pandemic, but now that it is here, we have perhaps the most unexpected of science experiments, a purest test of digital technology and how it's serving us, and maybe how it's not. And we've been studying this phenomenon across the world. We are in the process of developing a study across 90 countries to gauge how technology is shaping lives and livelihoods across 90 countries, which we will be releasing very soon. Today, what I wanted to do was to engage in a discussion on one country, and that country is the United States. And as it turns out, as the United States has gone through its process of digital survival, it is doing so as 50 different countries, because every state, and maybe more than every state, different counties, different cities and towns across the country are engaging with technology in different ways and reshaping and morphing their own behaviors in different ways. So we are trying to understand how our citizens of residents of this country surviving digitally as we are in the 7th month of a pandemic, and surviving digitally as we look for a month ahead into an election. And digital technology is the connector across all of these. So we're looking forward to having a conversation about that. Just to step back, I'm Bhaskar Chakravorti. I'm the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School. This is a research project that is housed at the Institute for Business in the Global Context at Fletcher. Fletcher is the oldest, preeminent, first graduate school of international affairs, of global affairs in the United States. And this is the kind of conversation that we firmly believe, can only be had at a place like the Fletcher School at Tufts. I would like to introduce my colleague who is going to be joining us in a conversation that we'll have shortly. But before we get there, a few points of housekeeping. Your mics have been muted in order to minimize any disruptions during this session. That said, we do not want your voice to be muted. we encourage you to participate in this discussion because this is an issue that touches us all. It touches us regardless of where we live in the United States. It touches us regardless of where we live in the world, because what the United States does with respect to the pandemic or with respect to the elections coming up affects every single person on this planet. So your voice is important, and we'd like to get your voice in the Q&A section of this webinar. So if you have a question or comment, or if you want to engage in the chat, type it into the Q&A, and several of my colleagues will be on hand to have your questions surfaced, and we'll have a conversation. I would like to, and the second thing that I would like to do is introduce my colleague, Steven Koltai, who is going to join us shortly. And one more point of housekeeping, feel free to engage in social media, Twitter, with the hashtag IDEA2030, IDEA 2030, to discuss or comment on anything that you hear on this show. So here we are. I'm assuming, Steven, you are on screen. It's a little hard to tell with my screen at this end. And Steven Koltai is sitting in Lincolnville, Maine. And the way we are going to run this is a three-part conversation. Part one is to share some work that we have been doing at the IDEA 2030 headquarters here at the Fletcher School, and getting a sense of how we are going through this process of digital survival, which is going to be a bit of a bird's eye view as we fly across the United States, look across 50 states and the District of Columbia. And we'll see some patterns coming out, some patterns that are encouraging, some patterns that are somewhat challenging and disturbing, some patterns that are contradictory. And then we'll have an opportunity to dive into one state with the help of Steven. So Steven Koltai has an illustrious career behind him. And I would say ahead of him, because he continues to remain engaged in work that takes him across, I think, across 36 countries. And currently, he is affiliated with a number of institutions, including MIT, the Fletcher School, and the Brookings Institution, where he's a non-resident senior fellow. Prior to that, he has worked at the World Bank, and most significantly, he was the founder of the Global Entrepreneurship Program at the State Department under the leadership of Secretary Hillary Clinton, where Steven spearheaded the application of entrepreneurship as a lever for peace. And he even wrote a book, a remarkable book on this subject. Steven, prior to that, has had a 40-year career with work in a number of large organizations such as Bankers Trust, Salomon Brothers, and McKinsey, and has also, and at Warner Brothers, and has been a serial entrepreneur. So Steven understands not only the use of technology in a variety of settings. He is currently sitting in Lincolnville, Maine, and he is using technology right out of there. And his most important role currently, which is what is going to be a subject of some part of our conversation, is that he is a member of the Lincolnville, Maine Broadband Committee. He's the board chair of Skill Lab, which is an Amsterdam-based developer of skills, skill assessment apps for refugees, migrants, and other job seekers. And he's also a residence, an entrepreneur in residence in Atlantica Ventures. So a number of different capacities in which he's currently looking at how technology is serving us and where it is not. So let me take a few minutes before I get to Steven. And Steven, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And what we'll do is we'll share a little bit about this bird's eye view, looking across the country. And then I will turn it over to you to give us a sense of what does it look like from the ground on up. And what are we learning about Maine's own challenges as it is surviving digitally through the pandemic? And also, Maine has a really interesting political situation in front of it. So how are all these factors coming together in that microcosm, and what can we learn from just this one state that can be taken to the 49 others, and potentially what can we learn to take us to other parts of the world. So with that, let me get us, is my screen visible? A little, can't tell here. I'm sorry. Just a minute. Speaking of technology, here we go. Okay. So here you are with the familiar map of the United States, which you're going to begin to see a number of different versions of this pointillist representation of the map. And so the first question we wanted to ask was, now that we are 7 months in the pandemic, how successful has each state been in keeping its people at home, given the pandemic raging outside? And it turns out that as you go from red to green, you're going to see a series of maps that are going to go from red to green, and red usually communicates a part of the country that is having some challenges, and green is a part of the country that is doing relatively well on the scale in which we are measuring. So right now, we're looking at a bunch of states that have had some challenges in restricting mobility of its residents, both in the workplace and in kind of in residential settings. And that picture becomes a little bit better as you go to a few other states, start filling in the Midwest and a few up in the Northeast, and you can see Maine begin to appear right there. And it gets a little bit better as you start going into the coasts and the Gulf region, and here we are. That is what the map of the United States looks like if you were to ask the question, how successful have these states been in keeping people at home? So we captured this data using digital technology by getting data from providers such as Google that have been, unfortunately or fortunately, been tracking our movements regardless of where we are. We may be worried about the fact that Google is tracking our movements, but from the perspective of doing research on how people are moving or not, Google has been a phenomenal partner in that process. Second, which states are digitally ready to facilitate working from home? So now that we are trapped at home, how successful have the states been in allowing us to be productive while we are at home, and particularly when we think about the digital infrastructure? So once again, when you look at states that have challenges in terms of the digital infrastructure, you can see the ones that pop up, the ones that are doing a little bit better. And once again, the ones particularly along the coasts and the Northeast and some in the South provide a better setting for productively continuing working from home. How successful has each state been in containing the virus, in containing the contagion? The states that have had some challenges, and the way we are measuring this is by studying the contagion rate and how that has been changing since the time the pandemic started, a lockdown order or a shelter at home order, and until just this week. So the states that have had challenges in keeping that rate of contagion down are the ones marked over here, primarily on in the Midwest and in the kind of the Northwest region. And then the next layer over, and the states that have done relatively better in managing the contagion over the course of the 7-month pandemic are over here. Bringing these elements together, we can see that the states that do relatively well in keeping people at home and facilitating productive working from home have in general also done well in containing the rate of contagion up till now. So this led us to asking another set of questions. Given that we are trying to connect to the world outside through our screens, through the tether that the digital infrastructure provides, how are we doing in terms of access to some essential services that are necessary for survival, in addition to being able to work productively? So before we get there, here is a quick correlation between the digital readiness of the state and the ability of the state to maintain its contagion rate and keep it low. So you can see there's a very clear correlation between the ability to keep the contagion rate low and the digital readiness of the state. And we'll return to this notion of digital readiness because it's the central theme that runs through everything that we are going to be talking about. So which states are best positioned to shift to telehealth, for instance? I have a spot on my nose and I need to have a dermatologist check it out. I'm worried about going to a hospital. I flip open a laptop and I have a consult. Well, would I rather be in Kansas? Would I rather be in Maine? Would I rather be in Alabama? Would I rather be in Vermont or Massachusetts or Mississippi? Well, we can help answer that question, again, through our red through green measures. So this map captures a number of different factors. One is there a telehealth policy in place in the state? And the other is there reliable broadband internet connection in the state? Because both are important in order to have reliable healthcare delivered to you digitally. And you can see the patterns are now shifting a little bit. Telehealth is not that easily, readily available in across the country. And particularly at a time of a public health crisis, this is a problem. Speaking of another problem, education. So because the pandemic is still not under control, the recommendations from the public health authorities across the country is that we cannot allow schools to reopen. So children are, in many parts of the country, have been kept at home and they're being educated over the internet. Well, that's great. That's great if you have reliable internet access. So here are a bunch of states across the country that do not have adequate broadband speeds and they cannot safely reopen their schools. So the ones that have a slash across them, such as Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Indiana, Iowa, the public health authorities are saying, keep your kids at home. But these states are also ones that have weak broadband infrastructure going into people's homes or affordable infrastructure going into people's homes. So parents are caught in a bind. I have to keep my kids at home and educate them from home, but I don't have reliable internet access. And this picture continues to look bleak as you look at parts of the country, other parts of the country, where the public health authorities are asking parents to keep their kids at home. South Carolina, Tennessee, Kansas, Idaho, Montana, Wisconsin. The slash tells you the public health authorities are saying, keep your kids at home. Our analysis shows that broadband infrastructure is weak in these parts of the country. So we are caught between a policy contradiction. Now there are parts of the country that are beginning to show green in terms of broadband access, and the public health authorities are telling us to keep our kids at home. Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Illinois, Minnesota, North Dakota. It's a little bit more coherence in terms of the policy recommendations. And then you have the states that do have much more robust digital infrastructure. And some, such as California, Washington, are recommending that kids be educated at home. Our home state here in Massachusetts, the recommendations keep varying. Just yesterday, the local authorities changed their policies regarding school reopening. So this is, of course, an evolving story. So the message I want us all to sort of take away from this is we know that there is a public health crisis, no question about it. But the public health crisis we know is accompanied by an economic crisis. It's accompanied by a healthcare crisis because we can't visit our doctors safely. It's accompanied by an education crisis, but that education crisis may not be so bad if we actually had reliable internet infrastructure that allowed our kids at least to be able to access lessons offered by schools. But we're looking at large parts of the country where that is not possible. And in some parts of the country, kids' parents have to drive them up to a parking lot outside a public library or a Taco Bell so that they can hop onto a Wi-Fi system and get their school lessons. A Taco Bell parking lot. This is supposed to be the #1 economy in the world. The #1 economy in the world, where the next generation is getting its school lessons from a Taco Bell parking lot. Speaking of the next generation and the #1 economy, we have an election coming up. 7 months of a pandemic, 1 month to an election. So we are all sitting at home and we're absorbing election-related information, the policy positions of candidates or the lack thereof, news about the candidates, whether it's the presidential candidates, the vice presidential candidates, the Senate races, we're absorbing it all through the media. How reliable is the information that we are getting? As it turns out, according to all measures, 2020 has been a bumper year for the fake news factories. In addition to the usual actors, Russian interference seems like it's back here. On top of that, we've had a pandemic, which has been accompanied by an infodemic. We've seen the emergence of QAnon, a supremacist group that has been running rampant ever since the pandemic started. Of course, they've been in existence long before, but they have gone into high gear since the pandemic. And now, of course, we are in election season. After the killing of George Floyd and the largest protest movements ever seen in the United States, another round of misinformation. And by the way, a recent study now points to one of the largest distributors of this misinformation relating to the pandemic and related events of 2020 is the White House Twitter feed. And then speaking of the White House Twitter feed, the recent positive COVID diagnosis of President Trump has led to another explosion of misinformation. Facebook has taken several actions. It has announced that it is not going to allow political ads a week before the elections. It has already banned QAnon from all its platforms, and it has even deleted it's deleted posts from President Trump comparing COVID-19 to the flu. But Facebook and all the other platforms that are trying to keep up with the misinformation, unfortunately, are still chasing it from behind. The misinformation is running ahead. They catch it and kill it, but quite often not in time, and quite often not entirely effectively. So the question that we asked is, if we were to now go back and look at the map of the United States, as we've been doing, which parts of the country are most vulnerable to being misinformed by all this media through which we are getting this information? And much of that information is coming over digital media, or digital media combined with broadcast media. And here's what the map looks like. Here are the parts of the country that are most vulnerable. So this is our first reveal of the misinformation vulnerability index across the United States. The first time this has been done. Parts of the country that are most vulnerable to being misinformed. the states that are marked out with a star pattern are the ones that are considered a battleground state, as in it is a state where the presidential race is close. So in addition to being vulnerable, the bad guys are also going to be focusing a lot, targeting a lot of misinformation in these regions. Here's the next set of states to worry about. The next set. And finally, all 50 states of the US and the District of Columbia. In addition to the battleground states for the presidential race, what we also have are the key Senate races marked out with a dark circle around to the extent that it's visible on your screens. And to make it a little bit more visible, here they are again. The states that one should worry about because they are highly contested in the upcoming elections. And now here are the states that are highly contested in the presidential race. Some may be leaning slightly Democrat, some may be leaning slightly Republican, but these are still the battleground areas where all the energies are going to be focused in the coming weeks. So if you are Facebook or Google or Twitter, if you are a broadcaster, if you are an active citizen advocating for the preservation of democracy, these are the parts of the country you need to focus your resources on in order to create awareness about the potential for mischief. And how you go about that varies depending on whether you're Facebook, whether you're a local television station, or whether you're a door-to-door canvasser. Of course, door-to-door these days takes on a different meaning given the fact that we are socially distanced. So here we are. Here we are with the state of digital survival, 7 months into the pandemic and 1 month to the election. I want to close with a couple more visuals. The Misinformation Vulnerability Index correlates very clearly with digital readiness. The parts of the country that are less digitally prepared, less digitally ready, are also the ones that are more vulnerable. And let me now dive deep into one state and bring in my friend Steven Koltai to give us the perspective from that state on up. And that state is the state of Maine on the top right-hand corner, north corner of the United States. And Maine is a beautiful state. I think if we could get a view out of Steven's window right there, it'll be an amazing sight. But unfortunately, the picture of, there you go, the picture of Maine that we see is that in digital readiness, it ranks number 32 out of 50 states. Its mobility change ranks number 38. It has done reasonably well in containing the virus, but its vulnerability to misinformation is 9 out of 50 states. So there are only 8 other states that are more vulnerable than Maine is. So many reasons why I worry about Maine, looking at it from a bird's eye view. But I would now ask my colleague and friend, Steven Koltai, to give us the ground view from Maine and some of the work that he and his colleagues have been doing and the experience that you have from the ground on up in using technology simply to connect, simply to survive, maybe to multiply, and hopefully not to divide. I want to also note a few things about the work that you have just seen here. This work comes out of the IDEA 2030 research project, which was launched just before the pandemic hit the planet, literally, and all of us became residents of this digital planet. This work has been done by an incredible team. And I would just like to note who the team is. So the team includes Christina Filipovich, Joy Zhang, Griffin Brewer, Ravi Chaturvedi, Devyani Singh, Malvika Krishnan, Patrick Ballard, Francisco Salazar, Joe Dunbar, Henry Fernandez, Miriam Amini, Heidi Acevedo, Chris Duyos, Sid Dayal, James Carroll, and Carissa Monteiro. There's an enormous amount of brilliance that has gone into this analysis, and I'm grateful for having such a fantastic group of colleagues that have helped us paint this picture. Not the most edifying picture, but hopefully a picture that causes us to pause and think about where we are in the largest economy in the world. This work has been made possible through a partnership with the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth and the Mastercard Impact Fund. They have been enormous partners in thought leadership for us over a decade now, and this is the latest turn in our collaboration with the Mastercard Center. So let me use this opportunity to switch over to Steven. Steven, how does this look from your vantage point?
Depressing. Thank you so much, Bhaskar, for having me and for doing this incredibly interesting work at this moment. I really just want to say a very few things that are relevant or that spring off of what you've said, and leave lots of opportunity for discussion. But I do think that, as with many phenomena, looking at it from a macro standpoint gives you one perspective, but looking at it from a micro standpoint is a whole different thing. You know, when we talk about more than 200,000 Americans who've died of COVID, that's a big number. When you talk about individual people, which so many news outlets now do, and which unfortunately many of us have friends and family, then it's an entirely different thing. And the same is true here. When you talk about the digital divide and the digital landscape in broad general terms, it means one thing. But when you're actually on the ground and looking at what does it mean in your town, in your community, it's a whole other thing. So we could have picked any one of thousands of communities in America and told an interesting story. It just so happens that, we're talking about this community where I live and where I have made my adopted home. I'm originally a Californian, and I moved to Maine very deliberately about 14 years ago, and I've lived here off and on full time. Since then, I now live here again full time. And I'm in the mid-coast of Maine. It's about a 4-hour drive to Boston. It's about 2 hours north of Portland, Maine, which is our biggest city, which is the size of many New York City co-ops. And then about an hour south of Bar Harbor, which is a beautiful place, the only national park that's on the ocean. And when you drive into Maine, as some of you will know, the first thing that you see is a billboard that says, "Maine, the way life should be." That's the state motto, the way life should be. And over the last few months, since I've been working from here, I've felt like jumping out of my car with a Sharpie and writing, "Unless you depend on the internet." Because it is the way life should be. It's spectacularly beautiful. People are great. Especially for those of us who love nature, you can't beat it. However, as those of us who have, because of COVID, become urban refugees moving into rural and ex-urban America, that has been a wake-up call, because what you experienced and what you assumed was normal, especially if you came from a big city, is not at all the norm in a rural, poor state like Maine. Couple that with some of the other things that Bhaskar and your team have identified. For example, the confluence of politics with that sort of poor internet connectivity. You know, Maine, we're a very small state. We have 2 senators and 2 Congress people, but it's a very important state this year because one of our Senate seats held by Susan Collins is one of the most important swing seats in the Senate. So if the Democrats were to take control of the Senate, it would almost certainly require flipping this seat in Maine. Susan Collins' Democratic opponent is Sarah Gideon, who was previously the Speaker of the House in Maine. And Angus King, who's an independent, is our second senator, who's from Brunswick, which is where Bowdoin College is, one of the jewels in the crown of Maine's higher education system. And actually, for Senator King, internet connectivity has become one of his top 2 or 3 priorities. I always joke, it's, you know, for everybody, the top 3 priorities are lobsters, and then it's whatever comes next. And in his case, it is internet connectivity. I would also say, just from a political standpoint, there are a couple of other fun facts about Maine. In the United States, where we are waking up to the fact that maybe our electoral system and the rules governing our politics need a new look, and maybe we even need to revisit things like whether the Electoral College has a purpose in 21st century America. One of the solutions that has been not just proposed but implemented is something called ranked choice voting. Maine is the leader in the country in ranked choice voting, which has primarily had the effect. What ranked choice voting means, for those of you who are not familiar, is that you don't just vote for your favorite candidate, you vote for your first, second, and third choices. And that way, as you go through the tallying, you are able to get the tally for the candidate who is the first or second choice for the largest number of people, not just the first choice. And one of the effects of this is to increase the center and decrease the influence of the 2 political extremes, which at this particular moment in American history is extremely important. Because it seems like the 2 political extremes are what govern American politics, and there's very little room in the center. Ranked choice voting mitigates that problem and results in more centrist candidates, generally speaking. So that's another reason Maine has been interesting. I will say that from a sort of a economic demographic perspective, as opposed to the political perspective, although I suppose everything touches on the political, it's also significant because, as with many things, internet connectivity is hyper-local. It's not a regional issue, it's not a state issue, and it's certainly not a national issue. It's much more granular than that. So, for example, you know, Eastern Massachusetts or the greater Boston area has an entirely different profile than Western Massachusetts. Similarly, Portland, Maine has an entirely different profile than someplace like where I live, which is 2 hours north of Portland on the mid-coast, in a town of 1,400 people. So there is, it's very important when you're looking at the remedies for these problems that you look at a hyper-local solution. This, by the way, is worsened by the fact that while we don't call it a monopoly, internet services are basically a monopoly in almost all of America. In other words, you have a choice of one provider. It's a de facto monopoly because theoretically there could be other incumbents. But in the vast majority of American towns, you know, there is only a choice of one provider. And I think that's also a very significant factor because, you know, assuming that you believe in the free market and competition solving many problems, This particular problem is not going to be solved by that because there is no competition. So what that creates is for people like me who live in this area, and interestingly, because of the urban exodus, property values in urban and rural America are going up. Rents and sale prices for houses are going up, whereas in inner cities, they tend to be stagnant or going down. Our public school enrollment in our little town has increased 20%, which is more than at any point in the last 15 years, because there are so many, we call them city refugees from Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Washington, who have summer homes up here. But Maine has the second lowest COVID rate in the country after Vermont. And all of our public schools are open. And so many people who come from places where the public schools are not open or only partially open, particularly if they have young children, have decided to stay past the summer into the fall, which has resulted in a 20% increase in the enrollment of the Lincolnville Community School, which, by the way, does not have a fiber connection. What has happened, and Bhaskar talked about this confluence of forces, the political, the technology, the economics, and the demographics, all are mixed together in this and we are a microcosm of that. So, you know, what do you do? Well, for somebody like me, so I am at this point sort of semi-retired, but I still do a fair bit of work, as Bhaskar said, internationally. One of the things I do is I work primarily with startups in developing countries, and that's my main job at MIT. And so I am on Zoom calls with people from Africa. So I noticed about 3 months ago, I was on a Zoom call with a startup team in Malawi, and I had the worst internet connection of anyone on the call. I had to continue apologizing to the people from Malawi, which is the 6th poorest country in the world, that I kept losing my connection. This was about 3 months ago. And so I set about trying to really dive into, since I do plan on staying here, what can I do to fix that? And the answer is a long story, but we're now embarked on one of the things that I think is happening all over rural and exurban America, which is community broadband, where we have realized that in today's America, the federal government is basically missing in action. So we can't expect the federal government to help this. And by the way, if you look at some other countries, as I know that Bhaskar and his team have done, broadband connectivity is a national priority and has been funded and built on a national basis. That's true of a lot of the best, the highest rated connectivity countries. Here it's the opposite. So here the national government is basically said, not our problem, we don't do that. And if anything, we will set up money. So there is money usually through the Department of Agriculture, which, by the way, is where the Rural Electrification Authority lives, which is sort of similar to what happened when we electrified America in 1930. What I think needs to happen now is something like that. And so there is, a pretty big amount of money, $16 billion at the federal level, but it's virtually impossible to get to it. It's impossible to get to it at the community level. So that you can't connect the dots. At the state level, in a small state like Maine, which has about 1.2 million population, it's the poorest state on the eastern seaboard. While everyone recognizes it's a big problem, there aren't a lot of resources available. There are a lot of sort of people who want to help, but nobody who's going to write the big checks to build the broadband. In addition, what we have in Maine is is a very rugged coastline with a lot of offshore islands. In fact, one of the fun facts about Maine is if you took the coastline of all the islands and all the rocky shore, it would equal the coastline of the entire United States. So there are a lot of hard to reach people. And what's happening is that communities who are desperate for this connectivity are doing it themselves. So community broadband has become a very big deal. There was just an article yesterday in the Bangor paper, the Bangor Daily News, about Monhegan Island, which for those of you who've been up here is a tiny place, but it's a very famous place. Lots of artists, everyone very high on the tourist visit list. It's a spectacularly beautiful place. It's got 40 year-round residents. It has about 2,000 summer residents, and they're going to do a community broadband, which was described. The same has happened here on an island just off the coast here where I live in Lincolnville, Islesboro. There are about a dozen Maine small communities, both inland and island communities, that have decided to build their own broadband. And that's what I think we are facing here in my town. And how you do that, how you finance that, how you deal with the politics around that, because in New England, we have a town form of government where basically anybody can stand up at a town meeting, express their opinion, and put a stop to most things. So how do we press ahead when, you know, there are going to be some people who just don't want any kind of change, even when it's positive change? These are some of the issues that exist at the local level here in my little town in Maine that I had hoped to give you all a sense of. So that's my backgrounder on life in Lincolnville in the internet COVID age.
Wow, thank you, Steven. Thank you for sharing that experience and the work that you're doing, and the ground view of what we have been exploring at a national level and at an international level. There are several things that I could touch on. One point that struck me as you were talking about community broadband as being the solution to closing the gap. Several thoughts radiate from that. One is, it reminds me of what I have seen across India, across many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where people don't have access to reliable electricity. So they set up their own generators. You have generators or inverters in every house. So this is the equivalent of what we are doing in, did I say this before? The largest economy in the world, for crying out loud. Okay, all right, I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it. Community broadband is a solution to a service that is now considered essential. If you want to educate your kids, if you want to visit a doctor, if you want to do banking sitting at home, if you want to get groceries delivered without getting sick. So this is, I would say, in addition to 2020 being a public health catastrophe, in addition to being an economic catastrophe, it is an information catastrophe. And the information catastrophe is not new. It has been with us all along, but now we are realizing the importance of not having that connectivity. Now, there's another thought that crossed my mind as you were sharing your experience, Steven, which is the migration from the cities of New England or New York and other parts of the Northeast and maybe other parts of the country. We're seeing a lot of migration away from the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. People running away from there, not just because of everything else that has happened over the course of 2020, but the fires and many of the companies there, encouraging people to basically work from home and possibly for a long time, possibly forever. So they might be moving to Maine. So guess what? You have people with means moving to Maine into what used to be one of the poorest states in the country, maybe raising the per capita income. Now, I'm worried about the degree of inclusion in the solution that we are talking about, because this community broadband, is it going to serve the people who are moving into Maine for all the reasons that we understand? And is it going to have a positive effect on the people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, who are residents of Maine, who didn't have access to broadband? So is there going to be a spillover? What do you think? Do you think this is going to be a localized phenomenon, or is it going to be a little bit more inclusive as these community initiatives progress across the state?
Well, I think it's one of the key selling points or education points that we have to make, even in a small community, is why does this matter to everyone? You know, in Islesboro, which is the island I mentioned off the coast, they have about 800 households. And their particular community fiber project, which is up and running and now complete, and has basically symmetrical, which is hugely important, 1 gig fiber for all 800 of those homes. They charge $30 per month per household, flat fee, $360 per year. That is less than, I would say, almost any American household in the biggest city with the best connectivity would pay for their connectivity. So they are getting top-notch service at a subsidized rate because the approach they took was, unless it is equal access at the same price for every single person who lives here, we don't want it. So one of the ways that they sold that, and Islesboro, by the way, is a community that has some very wealthy people, some movie stars, some celebrities who want to get away from everyone. And it has your typical Maine year-round fishing community that are doing 5 different jobs to get by and can barely afford their heating oil in the winter. So it's a very diverse group. But the way that they were able to go forward was by saying it's going to be cheap, it's going to be the best that's available, and it's going to be universally available. Everybody is going to be able to afford $30 a month connectivity. So I think that this again, it touches on another huge issue, obviously, in public discourse, which is income inequality. If you can structure the financial arrangements around the build and the operation of the system, which they were able to do, in such a way that you can subsidize the least those who are least able to afford the service, so that they too can have it, then I think you have a good chance of not only winning public opinion, but frankly, changing the game for everybody in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm wondering how much of this is translatable to other parts of the country, Steven. I know that, and I think it's a great point, which is we all, talk about all politics being local, which I believe is from our Fletcher alum, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But it seems like all internet is also local. If you don't solve the local problem, you don't get to the rest of the internet. So I'm curious about how, some of the other parts of the country that we saw, Louisiana, Alabama, Montana, that have all these challenges, to be able to educate their kids at home, and the public authorities saying, no, you can't reopen schools. And we are also seeing a high vulnerability to misinformation in many parts of these, the country. And by the way, Maine ranks number 9 in terms of misinformation. So I'm wondering how much of the Maine experience, the positive parts of it, can be taken elsewhere. I know that there were community initiatives that were attempted in places like North Carolina and several others, and they were challenged in the courts by the incumbent internet service providers because they said it is unfair for a community or even a public sector initiative to compete with a private company. So it was challenged by the courts, and I suspect there hasn't been a huge amount of traction on that front. One question that we've been mulling over here at Fletcher as we explore all these different phenomena that are washing around us. And another major phenomenon that is washing around us is the focus on the large technology companies, in particular Google / Alphabet, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon. And just a couple of days back, the House Judiciary Committee put out a huge report after a long investigation with a recommendation, a recommendation to proceed with a breakup action of these companies. Now, there are several initiatives, in play. But before, and the purpose of this conversation is not to comment on any of that, but I'm wondering whether our lawmakers and regulators, they are certainly focusing on some very important technology problems that we have as a society. Problems to do with data privacy, problems to do with misinformation, problems to do with the concentration of power in many parts of the technology industry. But what about this problem of lack of internet access? It seems to have just fallen off the radar. And we would like to kind of bring this back on the radar. And roughly half the country does not have access to reliable broadband, which is a crying shame.
Right. Well, let me just say on the first really important point you mentioned, which is the political obstacles to community broadband. Those are enormous, and the more you get into this world and the more you study it, the more you realize that you can't escape government, even if you don't rely on government. So even if it is not American to expect the government to solve this problem, at least at the state level, but also to some extent at the federal level, the regulatory environment has to at least be open to solving the problem. Otherwise, at the community level, you have no chance of succeeding. So, for example, you made the point about the right of communities to create not-for-profit public service broadband networks. That is against the law in about half of the states. Public entities cannot compete with private business in about half the states. Maine is not one of those, but there are 26 that are. So in those places, there is no point in trying because one of the incumbents, either one of the major incumbents, which are Spectrum, which was Time Warner Cable, or Comcast, which are the two largest providers, followed by Verizon, either the large incumbents will protest, or in the case of my town, it's a very small family-owned telecommunications company that's been operating here for 70 years who could claim that trying to do a community system is unfair competition to them, even though they don't provide the service. So on the one hand, the regulatory environment is such that they are able to claim exclusivity while at the same time not being forced to improve the quality of the service. So the regulatory issues, quite frankly, are inescapable. Now at the federal level, and again, this is a really important issue, and this relates back to a different time in my career. As you mentioned, I worked at Warner Brothers. I was actually there for a decade and was head of strategy there for a decade. As you know, the television airwaves are controlled by the Federal Communications Commission. However, the FCC and the regulatory environment around public access to the radio frequency and this radio spectrum has not been mirrored in the digital spectrum. So the FCC has generally speaking not provided the same sort of regulatory cover for people who want to innovate in the digital spectrum as it has for the broadcast spectrum. And that is, again, another area where a regulatory, you're not necessarily asking the federal government to pay for this, but you are asking the federal government and state governments to create the ground rules for open competition that would allow a player, the part of the problem here is that, is internet service a luxury or a necessity? In 1930, the federal government decided electricity was not a luxury, it was a necessity. And therefore, the Rural Electrification Authority was going to provide electricity to every single home in America, including the ones that were most remote and most distant. And pretty much, we have universal electric supply in America today. The internet has never been considered to be a necessity. It's always been considered to be a luxury. And the pricing and the economics around the internet have been those that govern the private sector, which means a 15 to 20% return on investment to the businesses that run those systems, as opposed to a utility return on investment, which is more like 5 to 7%. If we change the economics, then all of a sudden the internet would become a necessity and a utility and not a luxury.
So I think that's a perfect moment to kind of perhaps transition to a discussion with our wider audience. You know, this the one question that should hang over this discussion is, should the internet become like electricity or like the fire department? It's a utility and it's not a luxury. And does 2020 become the turning point? Because it's the pandemic and it's democracy. Democracy is at stake when we are being fed this much misinformation from this many sources. If half the country is so vulnerable, as our analysis suggests, this cannot be good for the future of not just the United States, but every country in the world. So let me kind of pause here and see if we can engage in a wider discussion. And let me introduce several more colleagues here on screen. Bhaskar Chakravorti, Joy Zhang, and Christina Filipovich to help curate the conversation and the questions that I'm sure are coming in.
So let me see. Thanks, Bhaskar. Steven, terrific conversation. You know, two of my favorite people, and I can't let you both off without asking you this question, because I'm privy to this conversation between the two of you, where you, Steven, asked Bhaskar, you know, given your work on Africa issues, technology, entrepreneurship, policy, et cetera, about, you know, how Maine compares to Africa in internet connectivity. And Bhaskar, you said Maine looks terrible, as our research shows, in digital readiness mapping, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa might be better, at least on some measures. Now, surely, you know, there's some truth to that. Now, the question to you, Steven, is, given all the, you know, terrific, you know, innovations that you have helped, you know, export out into Africa, what do you think we can take from some of these leapfrogging nations and bring it back home? So that's one for you. And Bhaskar, we also study the digital evolution of 90 economies around the world. You know, we have very, you know, we have views on the digital North, the digital South, and who's doing what on the many aspects that you outlined in this research today: education, healthcare, you know, COVID readiness, et cetera, et cetera. What benchmarks, which countries should be the ideal benchmarks for each of these?
Okay, I'll let Steven go first.
Well, I think, Ravi, the question you ask about, you know, lessons from Africa is one that we don't ask often enough. I'm a big believer in that innovation doesn't just go from north to south, but it also goes from south to north, as well as from south to south. So I think that you know, one of Bhaskar, for instance, mentioned that in, you know, developing countries, he mentioned India, but it's the same in much of Africa. You know, people, when necessity is the mother of invention. So when people are forced to come up with their own solutions for lack of electricity, they do. When people are forced to come up with their own solutions for clean water, they do. And that is very much what is happening in small town, rural America. We are clearly pretty much on our own. And while there are obviously huge advantages that we have over many places that I've worked in the developing world, there's no question about that. The challenges still are the same. And one of the things you have to do is enlist community support. You need to make the case to the people in the village, or in my case, my town, what's in it for you? Why should you care? Why does this matter to you? Which, by the way, is why research that people like you guys are doing is not only important, but needs to be very widely distributed, not just among elites. But it also needs to show up, you know, in the Bangor Daily newspaper article. It needs to show up on a local TV show about the things that you are prevented from doing or inhibited from doing when you have lousy internet, and conversely, the opportunities that are open to you when it improves. And they, you know, they run the gamut, as we've all discussed. So I do think that that lesson of getting the whole village involved is one that we need to learn from the developing world.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And Ravi, regarding your question about which countries should be used as models, you know, we can obviously come up with a whole bunch of countries, and we have studied them, which are the so-called role models for digital evolution, whether it is Estonia, Singapore, Uruguay, New Zealand, and I can keep going. But as I keep going, I'm kind of wondering, really? Estonia? How am I going to use Estonia as a model for the United States? It would take hundreds and thousands of Estonias to cover the United States. So my response on this is that the model for the United States should be the United States. We created universal access to electricity, universal access to the phone system right here in the United States. So let's go back in history, go back in time, and reinvent a model that works for the complexity and breadth and size and diversity of this country. We cannot import New Zealand into the United States. It has to work relative to the demographic and geographic and economic context of this country. So we, I think in the US, have to use a US model. And of course, it's easier said than done. Much more work needs to be done here. And this is why I would ask every single one of the decision makers who are either on this call or in other fora where they're talking about these issues, whether you are one of the major technology companies, whether you're on the House committee, whether you're on the Senate committee, whether you're on the Department of Justice, whether you're on the FTC or the FCC, reflect on what 2020 is teaching us about the state of digital survival of the United States, and use that as a basis for wise decision-making and perhaps collaborative decision-making, a public-private partnership that helps solve the problem in a uniquely American way. Let me see if Christina and Joy have questions.
Thanks, Bhaskar. So this question actually goes back to the misinformation. So they're asking about, is there actual causality or correlation between the digital dearth in some areas? And is it vulnerability to misinformation? Is it connected to a lack of diversity of info sources? Or is it connected to access to voter education perspective or something else?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And if Griffin has access to the slides, maybe you can kind of pull up the page that shows the correlation or the relationship between digital readiness and misinformation vulnerability. So our thinking on this is that it is both. There is both correlation and causation. So correlation obviously is what is popping up in the picture. In terms of causation, you can see the logic behind why there would be a causal connection between vulnerability to misinformation and the lack of sufficient digital connectivity. So there are many things going on here. One is that if you are digitally unconnected, that also translates into a number of other factors that contribute to higher vulnerability. If you have poor digital connectivity, that correlates with a lower socioeconomic position in the income ladder, lower levels of education, also connects to certain demographic segments and certain racial and ethnic segments, and all of which unfortunately have a very direct tie to higher vulnerability to being misinformed. So that's the correlation part of the story. The causation part of the story is that if I have limited access to the internet, then quite often the only access that one has to news is on this. So I go to my phone and I open up a social media platform to get my news. So if say 20% of the country is getting its news on social media, it's getting a certain filtered kind of news, and then it's getting what passes for news and information through social media posts. And I don't have alternative sources of information. I don't have the broadband access to then do the research, to go out and get educated, that allows me to triangulate information and fill out the picture. Then I am liable to be misinformed. So there is definitely a causation along with a correlation across these two factors. So fixing the internet gap, fixing the broadband gap, we believe is going to have a positive role in alleviating the misinformation problem.
Thanks, Bhaskar. I think we have one more question from the audience. I think maybe Steven should take the first crack at this one. The question is, regarding the monopoly cable companies have over in-home broadband, mobile wireless telecom companies say that 5G will allow them to compete with cable providers to provide in-home broadband. I see this as feasible in urban, some suburban areas, but not so as much in rural areas. What do you think?
Yeah, this is a very important point that's often discussed. And I, came into all of this also believing that 5G, and in my case, satellite, because I had some background in satellite television, would be part of the answer. There are all those projects. There's the Loon project from Google with the balloons in Africa that are floating over Africa to provide internet connectivity, and other over the air or through the air connectivity. And what I have learned is that actually it doesn't solve the problem, because what they are designed to do is download but not upload. They're designed for one-way speed but not symmetrical speed. And what COVID has shown us is that symmetrical speed is essential if you are, for example, doing what we're all doing right now, which is having a conversation. You need to be able to upload as quickly as you can download. It's not just about streaming a Netflix movie to you. Unfortunately, there is no competitor to fiber right now, fiber in the ground and fiber to the home, FTTH, that provides the same symmetrical ability. And so when you are talking about 5G or satellites or balloons or anything else that's through the air, you have to always consider the upload or the uplink speed as well. And that's why I don't think it's a real solution, much as I wish it would be, because obviously it would be much cheaper and much easier.
So we have a question from one of the audiences, and I'm tempted to add a tweak to it. As internet connectivity becomes foundational to other basic functions, including healthcare delivery, personal banking, applying for unemployment assistance, et cetera, most of which we covered in our research and in our past webinar. Do you see other government offices, local, state, and federal, partnering to help improve digital access? Steven, maybe you could take that, from a very Lincolnville perspective, to see how, Lincolnville could partner with the state of Maine and, state officials and federal officials. And Bhaskar, maybe you could talk about how and whether at all there is some role for public-private partnerships here, and how could that play out in closing these gaps?
Well, I will just say from the local perspective that, as I mentioned, at the very least, what you want is for all levels of government, town, county, state, federal, to not be an impediment. And when you have rules that prevent publicly owned utilities from competing with private providers, that is an impediment, which is very difficult to overcome at the local level. That is a state law, and you're breaking the law if you compete. I will also say, just as a segue to the public-private partnership question, that none of these community initiatives have been successful without public-private partnerships. That is to say, every single one of the cases, at least here in Maine, we have about 10 operating community broadband services all over the state. I mentioned the one in Islesboro and the one that's planned in Monhegan, but there are actually several all over the state. Calais has a relatively new one on the Canadian border, the New Brunswick border. Those are all public-private partnerships, and they all require some cooperation, at the very least in the financing stack. So for instance, the most common way of financing is to provide commercial debt that has some sort of either project finance guarantee, that means a revenue stream from the ratepayers, or from the taxpayers. They don't actually provide the money, but they're guaranteeing the debt. And so a public-private partnership, certainly when it comes to the financing, seems indispensable.
Thanks, Ravi. And your second part of the question was, if you don't mind just repeating it.
The second part of the question is, what, if any, and Steven teed up nicely, what, if any, is there a role for public-private partnerships, and how do you see them covering some of these gaps?
Yeah, the public-private partnerships is obviously a route to trying to address these issues. The challenge, of course, is that the public sector and the private sector moves in different orbits. So we need greater opportunities for collaboration across these sectors. And we need greater opportunities for leaders across these sectors to feel a sense of comfort crossing over to the other side, whether you're going from private to public or public to private, and to be able to speak the same language system. So there are, quite often there are differences in not only objectives and how you're organized and what incentives propel people to take certain actions. It's also simple things like language. We use different terms and technologies, and it starts getting horrendously complicated when you get into the zone of anything that remotely resembles technical stuff. So the first step is to kind of dissolve those boundaries and be able to have some comfort in playing at the intersection. The second is that this is a problem, as Steven pointed out, is repeated over and over again. Maine is a microcosm of the entire world. This is a problem that is exists everywhere. It exists in Massachusetts, it exists in Alabama, it exists in Malawi. So if we are to do a public-private partnership, how do you replicate that across so many different geographies? And given the context, the local contexts are enormously challenging and difficult in some areas. There's some rural parts of the country where it is extremely costly to take a line, a fiber line, and stick it into one home. Who's going to pay for that? So neither the public nor the private sector is going to be willing to do that. So my sense here is that, of course, we need a public-private partnership. We also perhaps need some kind of a framework that brings these partners together. And in terms of the private sector, I think we do need the large technology companies to participate. We do need the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world to be a part of this equation. As Steven mentioned, Google has the Loon project, originally meant to serve the developing world, but Google also has Google Fiber. So it does have access to the technology that provides internet access. And it is also in Google's commercial interest to grow the market. So there is an opportunity for the private sector to sit down at the table with the public sector and lawmakers and regulators. But that requires a degree of trust. It requires a degree of farsightedness. It requires a degree of wisdom. And I worry that in such a charged atmosphere, where even the public sector itself is divided because there's so much polarization within the private sector, within the public sector, and then the public sector and the private sector going head to head in terms of concerns about the power of technology, while we are all relying on technology, it requires us to be able to get out of this deep hole that we're in right now in 2020 and emerge in 2021 with a sense of, okay, this is the table at which multiple actors need to sit and come up with a collaborative framework. So I know it's not easy, but that's the only way in which we can make this work.
We have another question. So, and this is to both of you. Do you think the migration to rural areas that you, Steven, alluded to a little while ago, push the development of commercial broadband, especially in the induced by the pandemic and as people move up, or will it curb? Will the lack of broadband become in some sense a factor that curbs migration? That's one. Second, if there is some thoughtful policy of extending and expanding broadband coverage, what could that do to the future of the dispersion of jobs, information economy jobs around the country, and how could it, if at all, help decluster a little bit? Could both of you speak to that?
Yeah, I love this question. Before COVID, and I can't remember now if it was New Hampshire or Vermont or maybe both of them, they were giving $10,000 bounties. Vermont, $10,000 bounties to people who brought their remote, business to Vermont. And so if you were able to do your work, whatever it was, consulting, contracting, psychotherapy, whatever, remotely, and you came to Vermont, you got this bounty. I think that is going to be the rule rather than the exception going forward. I personally believe that, not just because of COVID, but there are a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, the Silicon Valley area, Boston, we're losing population because of the cost of living for a long time. And so I think that people have been looking for quality of life considerations, especially millennials, and to live in a tiny apartment in San Francisco when you could be living somewhere in Utah in the mountains was hard sell. So all of this, of course, depends on connectivity. And it's very much part of the argument that we make locally, which is, if you want clean jobs, high-paying jobs, interesting people moving into the community that support things like the arts and public education and not-for-profits, then a prerequisite is improving internet connectivity. So if you don't have that, then you will not get any of those other positive things. So I think that the lack of connectivity will discourage and will disadvantage certain communities vis-a-vis those that do offer it, and it will become a competitive advantage, just like it used to be back in the old days, parking, school, shopping, healthcare. We have a mall, come here. Today, it's going to be, we have fiber, come here.
Yeah, so I would just sort of add another dimension to this notion of allowing a dispersed workforce, and specifically looking at it from the perspective of diversity and inclusion. So if you think about the technology industry, Silicon Valley companies in particular, they are encouraging the workforce to continue to work from home. And of course, much of the work that the employees do can be done long distance. And many companies are saying that this is going to be a more permanent state of affairs. Now, simultaneously, pre-pandemic, particularly, I'm just focusing on the technology companies, but this is true across multiple sectors. There has been a desire to enhance the diversity of the workforce of these companies. So in particular, when you think about the proportion of employees in Silicon Valley who are from the Black community or from the Latinx community, that number has stubbornly refused to change despite all the commitments that many of the companies have made to expand the number of Black employees or Hispanic or Latinx employees in their companies. Similarly, the gender component hasn't changed a whole lot. It has changed a little bit, but not to the degree that one might expect. So this could be an opportunity to finally say, okay, perhaps we can now hire people from places far away from Silicon Valley or Boston or New York or Seattle, which is pretty much where 90% of most of these companies are, and perhaps say go to the greater Atlanta area. If I go to the greater Atlanta area, and this is research that we have done in the IDEA 2030 project, we have identified clusters, different parts of the country that have clusters of talented people from a diverse set of backgrounds that includes different gender background, different racial backgrounds, and then be able to identify parts of the country that also have a lower cost of living and have good broadband connections. So many positive factors converging. And an example of that is the greater Atlanta area, which happens to be a cluster of talent in the STEM fields, in particular in coding and artificial intelligence and data analytics, who are from the Black community. So why wouldn't you think of this as an opportunity to hire more people from the likes of Georgia Tech and the HBCUs in the Atlanta area, which are potentially a crucible for talent? And I see there's a lot of opportunity here, and hopefully the tech companies that are that have made some commitments to enhance the diversity of their workforce see this opportunity as a moment when they can finally make the change that they have been committing to for the last several years without a whole lot of success.
One more question from the audience here, and I think this, maybe Bhaskar should take this one first. Given the COVID-19 induced shift to digital and your state level analysis, how can private actors leverage this research? For example, should ed tech companies only target the green and flashed states?
Good question. Well, depending on what your business is in and where you are in your life cycle. So if you are, in the early stages of the life cycle, you are in the steep part of the growth curve, and you have to focus on where the opportunities are the greatest. If you are later in the life cycle and you do have resources to be able to fill in some of the gaps, and whether those gaps have to do with connectivity gaps or other forms of gaps that cause the digital readiness of a region to go down and go more towards the red zone, I do believe that more well-resourced private sector companies, certainly the technology companies, have the resources to be able to invest in those yellow and red areas with an eye towards those being the growth markets in the longer term. So it all depends on whether you're an early startup or a mature company.
So Steven, we'll have the last question of the day to you. And since we are a month away from the election, and you've seen the scoreboard on one of the slides where Maine ranks on telehealth, on COVID readiness, et cetera, that our research showed, if there is one thing that you would like your next senator, whoever it may be, to take on as her number one priority in the first 100 days, what would it be?
Well, I mean, obviously, given our conversation here, for me, it's this subject of really fighting for improved connectivity. In Maine, we have a favorable regulatory environment. What we don't have is any meaningful slice of the $16 billion of federal money that has already been appropriated. So to me, you know, bringing some of those dollars, which right now are primarily, as I said, through the USDA and the Rural Electrification Authority. Hopefully, a new FCC will also become involved in you know, steering some of this money. But that would be my number one hope.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Joe. And thank you to all of you for joining. We are here on the 8th of October, 2020, 7 months since the declaration of a pandemic by the WHO, just under a month to Election Day. Actually, Election Day is already in motion. Over 6 million people, maybe more, and definitely more, have already voted. So here we are. The common theme across these two phenomena is, of course, a global crisis of a pandemic, a global crisis of the economy, a global humanitarian crisis, you know, which sort of overrides everything. What we wanted to shine a light on was the information crisis, which in many ways is the kind of the connecting point across all of these. Not that solving the problem of information will solve all the other issues, but it is an important link, and if it is broken, it breaks everything else. If I could ask my colleague Griffin Brewer to just pull up our closing page, it gives us an opportunity to share with you some places to go to for further information and details on our work. We welcome your communications and messages, your ideas. We look for ideas and opportunities to collaborate with those who have insights, regardless of where you are. And if any of our work is helpful to you, this is why we do this work, so that it can actually be helpful to anybody who is interested in these issues and can actually take some decisions that make a difference. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to be in touch. And thank you to all of you and my colleagues who have participated in and actually built this enormous research project. And our thanks to our colleagues at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth.